Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. It is truly delightful to be here. Bishop Van reminded me I was invited 2 years ago. I think the first invitation came through. Never in my wildest dreams did I think when I arrived for the talk I'd be the auxiliary bishop of Los Angeles. So God does work in strange ways. I've told some people that adjusting to the weather has been one of the bigger things for me, and I mean it theologically because, see, in Chicago we have these horrific winters, and that's how you pay for summer, right? You slog through the winter, then you merit, you deserve summer. And here it's just strange. I live out in Santa Barbara, not a bad place to land, and it's always summer, and there's no need to deserve it. It's like pure grace. So I've had to undergo a theological adjustment coming out here. What a delight to hear about the honorees tonight, by the way, and to hear from two of the honorees. I've been a great admirer of Father Spitzer's for a long time, and then to hear the other stories was really delightful and very much congruent with the remarks I'm going to make. I realize everybody has already been a long morning. You've heard a lot of speakers. So I'm going to try to cut through this in somewhat short compass and leave out a fair amount, because I know you've had a workout already this morning. What I want to talk about is Catholic social teaching, especially in reference to capitalism. So this conference on business and ethics, it's a topic we talk about a lot. We often do so in very abstract ways. And I want to use the Church's social teaching to help us think through what it means to be an ethically and spiritually upright practitioner of the capitalist system. Pope Francis made a lot of remarks in recent years that have caused people to wonder what are his views on the market economy and so on. He himself said in response, what I'm saying is in line with Catholic social teaching. So I want to look at our economic system in terms of what the Church has taught now over the past 100 years or so. Here's an opening remark from John Paul II. John Paul II said that essential to the new evangelization is a sharing of the Catholic social teaching tradition. That's dead right, it seems to me. One way to make Catholicism appealing and compelling to people is to show how it relates to very ordinary life, to our business lives. So I think that's absolutely right. We won't evangelize well until we know what the Church's social teaching is. Now, first, just a couple of general theological remarks. Some people say, as you know, the Church has no business talking about economics and finance and business life. Churches stick to religious matters. Those are all secular matters. Well, see, first of all, that's simply repugnant to our view of God. See, if God is simply a distant supreme being, and many of our founding fathers thought that, it was a common modern view, God's a distant supreme being, well then what opens up indeed is a purely secular world that's only at best obliquely related to God. But see, that's not Catholic teaching in regard to God. It's not biblical teaching. Rather, for us, God is the creative ground of all existence, which is here and now giving rise to the whole of creation. Thomas Aquinas calls God ipsum esse, which means the act of to be itself, in and through which all things come to be. Well, see, what that means is there is no purely independent secular realm that's untouched by God. Rather, God impinges upon all of reality. Business, finance, economics, you bet. I mean, God has to do with all of that, and therefore the Church speaks on it. Here's a second overall reflection. Go to the very end of the Bible, everybody, the book of Revelation, and you'll see the descent of the New Jerusalem. Remember that John, the visionary, sees the New Jerusalem descending, the great and holy city, which is the terminus ad quem of the whole biblical revelation. What we're heading toward is the heavenly Jerusalem. Well, what marks it is the lack of a temple. It's a very curious thing, isn't it? Because that's why people went to the earthly Jerusalem, wasn't it? They went to go to the temple. So how come in the heavenly Jerusalem there's no temple? The answer is because the whole city has become a temple. Does that make sense? Think of a city, from sports to government to economics to finance to business to play to work. All that goes on in a city has now become a place of right praise, has become a place where, to use our phrase from today, everybody does the right thing. Everybody is turned to God's purposes. Well, that's the goal of the whole of biblical revelation, to sanctify every aspect of life. Now go to Vatican II, and I think everybody's still a largely unrealized and unappreciated teaching of Vatican II is the role of the laity is to sanctify the world. Once the priests have sanctified you through the sacraments and through the Mass and Eucharist especially, now, what? Go. Go in peace to sanctify the world. It'll be a topic for another talk, but after Vatican II, I think we largely dropped the ball on that idea. The church is there to sanctify you, that you might sanctify the world. Now, there's the building up of the kingdom of God. There is the realization of the heavenly Jerusalem. Now, all those remarks are meant to refute the claim that the church has no business talking about economics and finance and business. Yes, indeed, it does. Okay, so let's look very quickly at the tradition of Catholic social teaching, and I want to really end with a lot of John Paul II's reflections on it. So probably a lot of you know the general background. Beginning in 1891, Pope Leo XIII, one of the really great popes in church history, writes an encyclical letter called Rerum Novarum, Latin for about the new things. Well, the new things were the economic and political realities of that time, end of the 19th, and then let's say going into the beginning of the 20th century. What were the new things? Well, it was a largely unbridled, unregulated, undisciplined capitalism that was producing such a crisis in Europe and the West that it gave rise to socialist and communist reactions. And this was causing, as you well know, a lot of upheaval in Europe and indeed in our country. I mean, think of that period, early 20th century, when a lot of socialist and communist movements were getting a lot of traction in America. Think of the milieu out of which the young Dorothy Day came, for example. So these are the new things that Leo is reflecting on. What does he give us? Well, he gives us the fountainhead now of the Catholic social teaching tradition, which is a very clear judgment against socialist options and a sort of mitigated and carefully nuanced affirmation of what the church tends to call the market economy. It doesn't like the word capitalism, by the way, probably because it's been so politicized. Let me just say that again. It's the church's clear option against socialist approaches and a nuanced, morally refined endorsement of the market economy. You know, and that's why I agree with Father Sirico, the founder of the Acton Institute, who says often Catholic social teaching is characterized as a third way. You know, there's socialism, there's capitalism, then there's this third way. But that's not really right, it seems to me. It's a clear option against the socialist and a nuanced, careful endorsement of the market economy. 40 years later, so in 1931, a text comes out from Pius XI called Quadragesimo Anno, Latin for on the 40th year, so 40 years after Rerum Novarum. And in that wonderful text, he articulates the great principle of subsidiarity. Now, you know, it simply means it's best always to adjudicate economic and political matters at the most local level first. And only when they can't be adjudicated there should one move to the next highest level. So that principle runs through much of Catholic social teaching, a prejudice in favor of the local solution. I'll give you an example of someone who didn't get this. Many years ago when I was teaching at Mundelein Seminary, the students were complaining about the liturgy, you know, Quelle surprise. I mean, the students always complain about the liturgy. And one of the guys wrote 2 letters. He wrote one to Cardinal Ratzinger at the time, and a second letter he wrote to Mother Teresa, complaining about the liturgy. Well, Ratzinger never wrote back, but Mother Teresa did. And she wrote back and said, I think you should take it up with the rector. So she got it. I mean, she got the principle of subsidiarity, and he didn't. Go a little bit forward now, 1958, Pope John the 23rd publishes a text called Mater et Magistra, another text called Pacem in Terris, both beautiful, well worth reading even now. Paul VI, 1967, writes a text called Populorum Progressio, probably the most left-leaning of all the church social teaching documents. What becomes clear, especially in these, is the second master principle. If subsidiarity is one, the second master principle is solidarity. We're in this together. Whatever you say about business, economics, and finance, we're in this together. We're a communio. We're not just a vague collection of individuals drawn together by a social contract, but we are metaphysically, if you will, connected to each other. And so those two poles set the tone for much of Catholic social teaching. Subsidiarity, which you might say is a more conservative principle, and then solidarity, you might say a more liberal principle. Fine, call them whatever you want. They're both Catholic principles, and you see them emerging in these documents. John Paul II, and I'll say a little more about this as I go, writes a number of significant letters. Laborum Exercens from 1981, mind you, on the 90th anniversary of Rerum Novarum. Also, Solicitudo Res Socialis from 1987, and then my favorite, I think if you're going to read one document in the Catholic social teaching tradition, read this one, namely Centesimus Annus, the 100th year, right? So it was 1991, the 100th anniversary of Rerum Novarum. I think sums up Catholic social teaching better than any other document. Of course, Benedict XVI, too, writes a document called Caritas in Veritate. And then Pope Francis now has chimed in with the Laudato Si, which brings a whole new dimension. I probably won't have time to get into that. Okay, so that's a little overview of how the popes have articulated the Catholic social teaching tradition, subsidiarity, solidarity as basic principles. Okay, let's take a look now. I'll do this very simply. Capitalism, the market economy. What are the positive dimensions of it? How must it be cautioned or circumscribed? So first we'll look at the positive dimensions according to the popes. From the beginning, from Leo XIII on, and it's ratified by every single pope that came after him, the Church affirms the most central element of a market economy, namely private property. The Church is pro-private property. Now remember, back to Leo's time, 1891, there were a lot of people saying that private property is the whole problem. Remember the famous line, property is theft, from the Marxist tradition. Well, the popes say no to that very clearly. They affirm private property. Here are some of the arguments. The first one, the legitimacy of private property is grounded in the dignity and freedom of the individual. See, the Church hates the view that we simply become either cogs in the economic machine or simply elements within the movement of history. It hates reducing individuals to some element within a larger whole. No. Each individual made in the image and likeness of God is imbued with dignity and freedom. And private property, if you want, is the economic implication of that freedom and that dignity. Some are probably readers of National Review. Go back to William F. Buckley, the founder. Buckley talked about individualism as the principle. And he was very clear he didn't mean sort of modern individualism. What he meant was this Catholic idea that the individual matters in his or her freedom and dignity. So there's the first reason for private property. Second reason is borrowed actually from John Locke, one of the sort of founding political figures in our country. Locke said that by our very effort and work and energy, we mix ourselves with the goods of the world and we make them propre to us, right? Our own property. By our own efforts, which should be applauded. By mixing our energy with the world, we make it legitimately our own. So the popes affirm that as well. Here's a third argument for private property I find really interesting and important. Private property allows for a greater diffusion of power throughout the society. Catholic social teaching doesn't like the hyper-concentration of power in the hands of a few. Whether you say the few is the state, or you say certain oligarchic arrangements, the Church doesn't want power hyper-concentrated in the hands of the few. Rather, it wants to diffuse it throughout the society. And see, private property gives everybody the right to have access to the goods of the economic system. Spreading power widely abroad is a good way to keep tyrannies from developing. Now read people like Chesterton and J.R.R. Tolkien, right? Usually considered very conservative figures, indeed they are in many ways. But Chesterton's economic system he called distributism. What does that mean? It means distributing the goods of society, not, mind you, in a socialistic way, not in an imposed, state-sponsored way, but allowing for the greater distribution of value and ownership throughout the society. It's a good sort of check and balance. Some are old enough in this room to remember, I was a 13-year-old when I was watching the Watergate hearings. Remember back in 1973, I was 13. And my father trying to explain to me what was going on in our country. But I remember an exchange between one of the Watergate hearings figures, the senator, and one of the Watergate defendants. And the senator said, well, there's an old principle of English common law that every man in his own house is king. And the Watergate defendant said, well, that's pretty outmoded, Senator. And the senator said, I think it's still pretty good law. Well, you see, what that principle means is wonderful. That yes, indeed, in your own house, you're the king. That means power has been distributed widely throughout the society. It's a bulwark against forms of tyranny. So that's an argument for private property, says Pope Leo XIII. Here's the last one. I like it because it's very practical. Here's how Leo XIII articulates it. If we get rid of private property, quote, all incentives for individuals to exercise their ingenuity and skill would be removed, and thereby the very fonts of wealth would dry up. Now that sounds like Ronald Reagan, doesn't it, circa 1980? And it's an argument that goes back to Aristotle, comes up through the Catholic social teaching tradition, was often mentioned when I was sort of coming of age politically, and it's still a valid argument. Private property allows certain engines of creativity to be unleashed, and that produces wealth. Famously, socialism is a theory of the distribution of wealth, but not the creation of wealth. Well, that's part of the Catholic social teaching tradition. If I can quote Father Sirico again, he said, you want to get this point, ask yourself this question. Where would you rather go to the bathroom? In a private restroom or a public restroom? And that will tell you a lot about this principle. Okay, here's a second now major feature of the market economy that the church likes, that it endorses. And we heard a lot about it today, and we've seen it in action, which is great, namely entrepreneurship. The church likes the entrepreneurial spirit. And nobody articulates it better than John Paul II, probably because of the personalism of his philosophy. That's the philosophy he was trained in. Listen now to John Paul about entrepreneurship. The entrepreneur, his intelligence enables him to discover the earth's productive potential and the many different ways in which human needs can be satisfied. It is his disciplined work in close collaboration with others that makes possible the creation of ever more extensive working communities. We saw a good example this morning. The entrepreneurial spirit. Creative, visionary, courageous, energetic, risk-taking. I mean, all of that is a healthy element within a political economy. If you get rid of that, you get rid of the engine that creates wealth. And so the church approves of it. Here's where someone like Michael Novak comes in. I'm sure some of you know his writings, where Novak has argued now for about 30 years that a market economy requires all kinds of moral discipline. Novak's argument, there are exceptions obviously, but in the long run, a bad person will make a bad capitalist, right? A morally bad person in the long run will not be a successful partaker of the market economy. Well, how come? Novak argues the market economy calls forth a wide variety of virtues. I'm quoting now. Diligence, industriousness, prudence in undertaking risks, reliability and fidelity in interpersonal relationships, as well as courage. Quite right, it seems to me. All those moral virtues are called forth by the market economy. Think for a moment of the moral discipline involved in the signing of a contract. I know the point you were making about contracts, but the contracts are the rock foundation of much of the market economy. But think of the moral discipline involved in writing and fulfilling a contract. A bad person in the long run will not fulfill contracts and will not therefore be an effective capitalist. Here's a third thing now that the church approves of in the market economy. Profits. It might strike you as surprising given the strong biblical railing against the rich and so on. And I'll get to that in the second part of my little presentation. But the church likes profits. How come? John Paul II again says, profits are a concrete indication that a business is functioning well, that productive factors have been properly employed, and that some human need is being successfully met. You see, those are all good things, and the turning of a profit is the best possible way to gauge whether all that is in fact the case. In fact, take profit-making away, John Paul II argues, and there's no way to determine whether a company or corporation or business is in fact satisfying these basic requirements. And then you've got a lot of businesses hanging around that shouldn't be hanging around. Now, what he's got in mind is his communism he experienced, isn't it, in Poland and the Soviet Union. You take away profit-making, you take away the one reliable gauge we have for determining whether a business ought to be in existence. Even, says John Paul, excess profits can be to the good. How come? They're a sign that other entrepreneurs ought to get into that game. So if someone's making a lot of money in some area, well, the courageous, risk-taking, visionary entrepreneur said, hey, I want to get in that game. I can make some of that. It calls forth more creativity and therefore the creation of more wealth. So profits, even excess profits, have a role to play in a political economy. Okay, so far so positive, and that's great. I think we shouldn't forget all this side of the Catholic social teaching tradition. It likes and affirms the market economy. Okay, but there's another side of the story. The church also cautions and circumscribes and sets limits to the market economy. And I think being attentive to both sides is getting the full picture. So, what are some of these necessary cautions as we listen to the popes? Well, following Thomas Aquinas, my great hero, who affirmed private property. Yes, indeed, he did. And for many of the reasons the popes cite, Thomas Aquinas affirms it. At the same time, Thomas distinguishes between the ownership of private property and the use of private property. Ownership, yes, but then there is the use of private property. Now, what does he mean? He says, when it comes to the use of what we legitimately own, we must always keep the common good in the forefront of our minds. Let me say it again. Yes, we have a right to private property, but in regard to the use of private property, the common good, not my own good, should always be uppermost in my mind. How come? Well, he says, because of the universality of creation, that God made the whole world for everybody, not just for me. Oh, but I've been full of entrepreneurial energy and creativity and courage. Yeah, good, great. And you've generated wealth and you have a right to that property. But in regard to the use, the common good must be uppermost in your mind. Here's a rather startling text from the Aquinas. Listen, Pope Leo quotes him. If the question be asked, how must one's possessions be used, the Church replies without hesitation that man should not consider his material possessions as his own, but as common to all. Wow, extraordinary, isn't it? This is a guy affirming private property, but now the use. Here's Vatican II in Gaudium et Spes, quote, of its nature, private property has a social function, which is based on the law of the common purpose of goods, right? The common purpose of the goods of the earth. And then this line from Rerum Novarum, from Leo XIII, that I've always found startling. I use it almost as an examination of conscience. Listen to the Pope. When necessity and seemliness have been satisfied in your life, there is the duty to use what is left over to relieve the poor. As I say, during Lent, that's a really good point of examination of conscience. So necessity, the necessity of life, and seemliness. That can be defined broadly, of course. But once that's been met, everything else, I've got a duty to help relieve the poor. Mind you, we're not talking about coercion on the part of the state here. This is not someone advocating socialism or communism. but it's a kind of moral impulse that comes from within the conscience to use our property for the common good. How about this from St. John Chrysostom, echoed by St. Ambrose of Milan, now from the ancient church? If you have two shirts in your closet, one belongs to you, and the other belongs to the man who has no shirt. Wow, that's an extraordinary claim, isn't it? We're affirming private property, affirming market economy, affirming all that. But now the use of what you have. If you have two shirts, one belongs to you, the other to the man who has no shirt. You know, here's the spiritual point, everybody, that governs this whole thing. I like to put it this way. Your life is not about you, right? It's your life. It's, private property, individual rights and dignity, it's your life, but it's not about you. See, your life is now in the context of a far greater spiritual horizon. Your life is about doing God's purposes. So here's the right question for wealthy people. And, look, everybody in this room, including me, we're all wealthy, looking at the whole world. We're all wealthy people here. The question is, why did God allow me to have this wealth? Why do I have this wealth? Not simply, well, how can I use it to satisfy my needs, but rather, why did God allow me to have the wealth that He's allowed me to have? See, your life is not about you. Second caution now, again, without gainsaying for a second the legitimacy of the market economy and entrepreneurial freedom, the church is very willing to speak of the state's legitimate intervention within the economy. Now, why? To control it? No. We used the image of the referee earlier. Think of you're watching kids play basketball. What's a good referee? Is someone that intervenes quickly, decisively, and then backs out of the game, right? Let the game go. A referee that's fussing over every single call, calling every single possible, the game breaks down, right? It gets hyper-controlled. So the popes tend to say, the state can and should intervene at times, but in the manner of a referee, whose purpose is to restore the balance and energy of the market, not to destroy it or supplant it, but to restore it to its proper dynamism. When should it intervene? Well, when people are denied fundamental things they need to get into the market, namely education, crushing debt, insufficient wages, lack of elementary social services, especially unemployment insurance. So the popes mention all these things, but again, what's the point? Not to undermine the market, but to give you the capacity now to enter with dynamism and creativity into the market. It's a state intervention to discipline and enliven the market. That's how they see it. Just a couple more points, and I promise I'll bring it to a close. Thirdly, and most importantly, I would say, the market has to be situated, the popes say, within the context of a wider culture of life. It's not just on its own. Let the market go any way it wants to go. No. It must be situated within the context of a culture of life. What does that mean? Well, they love democratic political systems, the popes. They like a system of checks and balances. They like a tripartite governmental system like ours. They affirm that. That should be a legal context for the market. More to it, this political system, along with the economic system, has to be in the context of certain moral values that are not themselves subject to the ups and downs of the market, subject to the ups and downs of changing political opinion, but are themselves firm and absolute. Doing the right thing, we've heard about today. Well, what is that? But being deeply in touch with the unchangeable moral values, knowing very clearly what acts are intrinsically evil and which ones are not, knowing what's right and wrong. That has to be the moral context in which the market legitimately operates. When that breaks down, that's when cultural chaos comes. Now listen to Pope Benedict XVI talking about a dictatorship of relativism. Right? See, that's the enemy of everything. That's the enemy of politics. It's the enemy of economics. See, and that's why everybody, through the Catholic schools and through Catholic families, the training of people in these values is so indispensable. Can I just say this? You know the fact that 75% of our own Catholic brothers and sisters don't come to Mass on Sunday? You know, that's the stat in our country, and we're doing pretty well compared to Europe. But 75% stay away regularly from the source and summit of the Christian life. Can I maintain that is very dangerous for the wider society? That is not just an inner-churchy problem. And you see why? Because it's precisely at the Mass and through the sacraments that we're learning the values that must circumscribe a properly functioning market. Without those values, and see, some in this room are old enough to remember a world when that was taken utterly for granted, what these moral values are. Trust me when I tell you, I deal with young people all the time, they are not taken for granted now. And that's why I would tremble precisely for the political system and precisely for the economic system when these values aren't being clearly communicated. That's why, again, Catholic schools, Catholic families are so indispensable. Why John Paul II, over and over again, placed such a stress on the family. And why right now we're moving through those 2 synods on the family. We're waiting Pope Francis' statement on the family. It's not just being kind of old-fashioned and nice and pious. That has huge implications for the society. Where the family has broken down, the society's broken down. Is anybody surprised by that correlation? I'm not. And that's exactly why, and why the church stresses it. Okay, I'm going to bring it to a close with a last quote from John Paul II, from the great Centesimus Annus. And this is something, I've used it over and over again. Please, you use it when people say, what is the church's view on capitalism, on our economic system? So John Paul closes by answering. The answer is obviously complex. If by capitalism is meant, listen now, an economic system which recognizes the fundamental and positive role of business, the market, private property, and the resulting responsibility for the means of production, as well as free human creativity in the economic sector, then the answer is certainly in the affirmative. The church likes all that. However, he says, if by capitalism is meant a system in which freedom in the economic sector is not circumscribed within a strong juridical framework which places it at the service of human freedom in its totality, and which sees it as a particular aspect of that freedom, the core of which is ethical and religious, then the reply is certainly negative. That to me is a wonderfully balanced statement of what the church has held now for well over 100 years about our economy, our market economy. So I would say to all of you, go forth and participate in that market with great confidence. As long as the distinction between ownership and use of private property is really clear in your mind, and as long as our market system is circumscribed by values, mind you, that aren't going to come, creeping up from the earth. They're going to come from us. They're going to come from our teaching. As long as that's in place, then I'd say you're in a very ethically and spiritually and morally positive ground. And my last word to you is Vatican II again. Go back to Vatican II. The church is like Noah's Ark. That's an ancient image, like Noah's Ark. It's a place of refuge amidst all the storms of the world, where a microcosm of God's good order is preserved, right? But the point is not to stay on Noah's Ark. The minute the ark comes to rest, what does Noah do? But he opens the windows and opens the doors, and he says, go out, and now bring life to the earth. See, that's you. That's you. The Noah's Ark is the great sacramental and Eucharistic life of the church. Terrific. Where life is preserved, where we learn the great values. But now, go. We open the doors, open the windows, go out, and in the spirit of the liturgy, sanctify the world. God bless you all for listening today. Thanks.